City of Stevens Point Public Protection Committee meeting, recorded February 10, 2020.
I will call the City of Stevens Point Public Protection Committee to order. It is 6:12, Monday, February 10th, 2020. We have 4 different items to take care of here on the agenda. The first is a license list for new operators, provisional license for new operators or new bartenders. And I believe there are 21 of them who are applying for a provisional. And then we also have temporary Class B licenses. They're called picnic licenses often, for 3 different events. St. Joseph Parish, their Winterfest on February 21st, Central Wisconsin Children's Museum, Happy Hour at the Museum on March 27th, and St. Peter's Parish Picnic. St. Peter's Parish Picnic is June 13th. Would you like to take these licenses together, the temporary and the provisional?
Sure.
Okay,
Yes.
All right. Chief Skiba, do you have any concerns, or you've vetted these already?
We have vetted all of these, and we have no issues with them, and several of the picnics are reoccurring.
Okay, that's good, yeah. All right, so that's good. Any comments or questions from the committee members? All right. Anyone out there, public? No? All right.
Okay, Alder Nebel has her hand.
Oop.
I'd like to suggest that we approve the license list and the operators and also of the temporary Class B picnic licenses.
Very good.
You're making a motion, to be
Yes.
clear? Okay, I second.
All right. So, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, the motion carries. What is it? 4. Yeah, 4-0. Okay. We have we have a request to hold street closings for 2 different events. That's our second agenda item. First is the Run for Life. It's a color run, sponsored by Spash HOSA. That'll be April 18th. And the Trivia Parade, UWSP, 90 FM, and that's on April 17th. And both of these are recurring. They've happened before, and they work all right for you?
Yes, and some of the potential issues have been addressed, such as obviously with the color run, as identified in the packet, there are areas that have been identified that they will not be utilizing that coloring within the park.
And they understand that?
Yes.
Yeah. And didn't they also want auxiliary police?
So yes, part of that is because of the particular closures.
Yeah.
We do have auxiliary unit that assists with that.
Good, okay. All right. Any questions or comments from the members? Yes?
I would just make a motion to approve the license, or the request for the street closing.
I second.
Okay. Any discussion? Anybody from our public who would like to talk? All right. We've got a motion, we've got a second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed?
Motion carries.
Motion carries, 4-0. All right. The next item is Ordinance Amendment, Chapter 21, Building and Premises Maintenance and Occupancy. And this is about revisions to the ordinance. And I would like to take a moment here and read aloud very quickly the basic changes that are being proposed here by our neighborhood coordinator, neighborhood improvement coordinator, Mark Cordes from Community Development. I'll go through these quickly. There's a designation of a code official for enforcement versus the building inspector. And I think Mark is here, and he could probably clarify some of this, too. The next one is removal of terms defined in other sections of the city codes. That is housekeeping. That sounds like a good idea. Removal of trash and recycling standards and put them into Chapter 7 where they rightfully belong. Regulation of composting in size and location. Limitation of height and location of firewood stored on the property. Addition of the ability to regulate recreational vehicle storage location on the property and the total number parked off of a hard surface. Addition of the sidewalk snow removal language. Addition of lawn maintenance and specific height standard, which was previously not addressed anywhere in code. Addition of a provision for natural native lawns or undeveloped large lots to deviate from the lawn standards with submission and approval. Addition of the ability to regulate outdoor implements such as grills, lawnmowers, snow blowers, stored outside, in total number of each. Addition of more specific language that gives the ability to enforce mold and/or conditions of excessive moisture in dwellings. Addition of language preventing direct channelized, such as rain gutters, discharge of stormwater onto neighboring property. And modification of ceiling height requirements to more closely resemble how they were enforced and granted through building permits that were issued in the 50s and 70s. Further clarification of what constitutes a public nuisance. Clarification of the city's ability to assess costs based on statute. Change of appeals from the Public Protection Committee to Administrative Appeals Board. So that's the summary of it, but there's a lot more to it. And I would like to ask if Neighborhood Improvement Coordinator Mark Cordes or Director, okay? If you could tell us a little bit more.
Sure. I don't know the best way that you want to go through it. I think it's probably to follow the memo and go through it page by page, and starting with definitions. Well, I guess we start on the first page. We can see one of the things I called out was code official. Based on how this was originally drafted, it said building inspector, and even prior to my time there, that probably didn't make sense that it said building inspector. The reason many codes use the word code official is we can designate not only myself but other people within the department to enforce the code. So it's a very good term and doesn't limit us to just building inspector. So I think if we jump right in at definitions, if that's all right with everybody. Just 2102 definitions, we just clarified that if these terms are defined somewhere else in city codes, those definitions would apply. So we went through the other codes where we had duplicate definitions and that we didn't feel that they fit in this code. They fit better in either zoning or a building code or something like that. We remove those from this code, again, to avoid duplication. And a lot of times those definitions didn't match. So it makes sense from a housekeeping standpoint to keep it to a single definition, even if it's not in this code. But again, we thought it was mostly used in this code, we kept it here. And we would remove it, look at removing it like from the zoning code, for instance. I think when Kyle comes forward with zoning code amendments, there's some duplication in there. You may look at removing some of those terms.
You had a question? I have a couple questions on the definitions that are being taken out that I would like to ask a little bit more about. One of them is about the multiple dwelling, meaning definition and the permissible occupancy. Those are two areas that if it's talking about maintenance and occupancy, I would think that that would be appropriate to be, whether you have it in zoning also, but to also be here because we're doing maintenance and about occupancy and what's permissible. And I think some of those need to be in there. I can understand why plumbing isn't in there and privacy and a few other things, but those are ones that I really felt are the ones that have been issues in the past, and it's hard to look through that zoning stuff and to be able to figure out what the heck some of that means. It's very confusing. To have this in with our maintenance and occupancy, those are two of the areas that I think are really a big deal, and what we have as a maximum number and what's permissible. So I think that should be staying in there. I noticed that the standard driveway is out of there, and I'm understanding that'll be in with, also with zoning. But again, it also applies a lot to the maintenance and occupancy of the areas, especially around, and I'm going to say the university, but in the middle of town, not just the university. And the other one that it looked like you were taking out all of the responsibility as owners and occupants, number 2103.
Yeah, I think you're getting beyond definitions.
Oh, that one, sorry, that's the one part, okay, I'll wait on this one. And then about, and some things about, I think those were the only ones on definitions that I was really,
Okay, and so just to be clear, if we're taking definitions out of here, they are already defined somewhere else in the city code. And the ones you referred to are specifically defined in the zoning code.
yeah, I agree, they are. But again, like with the hard surface and all of those things, these are all still under maintenance and occupancy of people.
The other thing I would point out is with some of those things you brought up, actually there was a conflict between this code and the zoning code. So the zoning code does change, in fact, the hard surface has changed recently in the zoning code. So if we're going to have dual definitions, then we need to go back and modify two codes rather than one code, and it becomes cumbersome. So the idea was to simplify, I think as Kathy had said, housekeeping. That's really what this is about. I realize for convenience for the average person, but I don't think we have a lot of average people that are sitting down and reading our zoning or property maintenance codes.
Alder Dalton?
I guess, one, I would respectfully disagree with that, because I think that the more clearly that we can articulate and define things, because people often have trouble going through the zoning code, and if they're getting a notice of a violation to the codes, those definitions would be there. But beyond that, the question that I wanted to bring forth at the beginning of this discussion is where exactly the origins of these revisions are coming from, because as a legislator in this body, I didn't request these. I'm wondering if an older person did, or if these are coming from staff, because I see that as kind of a fundamental
Sure.
just conflict about
that's-
the intentions of these revisions.
A good question. Actually, it was one of the first things I was asked to do when I was hired for this job, is to either modify this code or look at the International Property Maintenance Code. And that was from the Director Ostrowski at the time. We went back and forth. I have the International Property Maintenance Code, which is tremendously more cumbersome than this will ever be. And my feeling was this code has served us fairly well. People are familiar with it, but it did need some updates. So the areas I've updated, again, definitions, there's some things, I think the memo hits it pretty much right on the head. No lawn maintenance. That was never defined in the code. Storage of RVs, just and some small things. I would say most of the code-related items from an enforcement standpoint, some of these items I've added in there, they don't affect 95 or even 99% of the people in the city. It's for the 1 or 2%, like the grills and lawnmowers and snow blowers. It's not everybody. It's those few properties I run across where they have 20 or 30 snow blowers sitting in the backyard. Well, according to our ordinance, that's fine. But if you're a neighbor that has to live next to that, that's a whole different story. It's the same thing with RVs parked off of a hard surface. We tried to come up with a reasonable number. We tried to come up with location. Right now, they can be parked in the front yard, and some people do. They park several in the front yard. Again, it's fine until you have to live across the street from it and look at, a snowmobile trailer and a camper and a boat parked in somebody's front yard. Then it becomes an issue. So a lot of these are things over the last 3 years I've seen and think we need to, and first of all, let me say, I'm not pro-regulation. I think we need to regulate on a minimal basis, but these are things that have come up on a somewhat regular basis where we don't have anything in our ordinance that I can go and enforce it. Again, the grills, it seems silly, but until you run across a situation where you see it and you look at our ordinance, well, what's he violating in our ordinance? You can go under public nuisance, but that's such a broad definition. So again, a lot of these things are housekeeping in my estimation. If you want to keep dual definitions, that's certainly up to you. I think, when we looked at definitions, what we did find is there was conflict. And many of those things that Cindy brought up, multiple dwellings was different in zoning versus this code. The definition of family was different in this code versus zoning code. So, while I understand, somebody looking at that, they can get the wrong information, because then, from a practical standpoint, we have two different definitions in our city codes. Which one dictates? In that case, dealing with family, I would argue the zoning code, because that dictates, what happens with zoning and land use in a dwelling.
I guess I'd like to say that we did not bring up, it went to a whole different committee about family and about the numbers of required for occupancy. It went to city planning, and so there's some of these things that have changed. It is hard because we did change things about the hard surface, and we have asked that it's contained, and I think it needs to be in here so people are aware of that has changed. I still think we need to have them then put the correct ones in, because I think they need to be in here, and it is very difficult, and even as an alder, knowing and have read these for so long now, I'm so confused, because you have changed things in zoning, and we really haven't been involved in it. And so, all of a sudden, things have been changed. I would like to know exactly what things mean in the maintenance and occupancy, because that is something I'm very involved in, and it's also the place where people do go to look on, like we talk about recycling. Yes, we had it before, and that was one of the ones that we had. Garbage and containers and recycling was in Chapter 7 under sanitary and safety. And then we also had it here, and they had two different things, and I brought it forward. And it got revised here, but now I don't know what it's going to mean in the other one, because it's different than what it says in Chapter 7. And on top of that, there's a whole different person that is in charge of handling that situation. In that Chapter 7, it goes to sanitation department. I don't know who that even is. So if there's something where people's garbage is being left out, and where that happens a lot, and it's not closed like it's supposed to be, but now that's in a different chapter, and a different person's supposed to be handling that, it's taking it away from here, and it is a big issue in our city neighborhoods. The garbage that is left out, that is open, that is left in bags sitting out, that is, all of those things are important. I understand heating, plumbing, flushing water, fair market value, those things being out of there, but I think anything that has to do with you maintaining and occupying, so people know what is required of you as a homeowner even, is right there. And to have to go back and forth into the zoning is very hard. It really is.
So, if I may, just real quick to address that, with the codification of this code, we could amend it and bring this back to public protection down the road, wherein the definition of family specifically calls out the zoning definition. So instead of removing it entirely, we can add it in here and say, refer to Chapter 2302, subsection 9, for example, and use that as the base. And so then when folks go on the website and look up the nuisance ordinance, they can click on that, and it'll take them right to the definition of family within our ordinances.
So what is our definition of family right now?
Still 3.
Yeah, still 3 unrelated individuals. And Plan Commission at the last meeting indicated they would be open to opening up that conversation, changing that as well.
Right.
But, as we refer to other codes and other definitions and other documents within the city, this helps clarify. So we don't have dueling definitions and dueling ways of enforcing this. We can include some of that to say, refer to this when we say family or the sanitation department or things of that nature. But as we go through this, if that's what this body wants, we'll definitely revise this and bring it back.
Yeah, I want to mention that I think I've probably been as involved as an alderperson, and before that, as an activist with property maintenance, as involved as Alder Nabel has been. And I've discussed and tried to deal with a number of the things that we're talking about here in the property maintenance possibility here. I like Alder Nabel would prefer that we leave a lot of it in the property maintenance.
For definitions.
Yeah, definition, in the definition area.
Well-
That's where people look, because it's so, if they look, it's so clear, that's that property maintenance, here's the way I should be maintaining my property.
So I guess similar to what Ryan's suggestion was, with which I agree with, if you want to put family in there, we can put the section
Yeah.
that it's in the zoning code. Again, it becomes cumbersome once you start multiple definitions for the same thing in multiple codes. Every time you modify one, you have to find out where it is in another code and make sure it's modified to match that. Where if we just, let's say family, for instance, we cite the section of the zoning code where we can find the definition. So even if that definition changes, it'll still take them to that same spot, even if it changes. And so that's something we can easily do. We can keep the definitions in there, but where they're in other sections of the code, and they're pertinent to this code. The other thing is, when I went through and looked at definitions, there was terms defined in this code that didn't even exist in the code. So it doesn't make any sense to define a code that doesn't exist in the code. So that was another reason some of the definitions were taken out. They weren't used anywhere in the code, so there was no reason to define them.
Anyone else on the committee?
I was just going to say, majority of people, when they're looking at the codes, do they normally just look at them online? Is there a way to just link it?
Yeah, I mean, everything, all of our codes for the city are in PDF form, which is something that we need to definitely upgrade through MediaCode, and I'm working with the clerk's office to address that. But it's something that you can link. It's a little cumbersome at times, but if you update to like a MediaCode, it's really nice. You can just link it directly to the definition. Alder Dugan, what I'm getting from this conversation is maybe this is too big of a slice to bite off right now. So what I'm thinking, maybe we'll bring it back in sections. We'll start with definitions. We can duke it out at Plan Commission, at
That's
Public
an
Protection.
excellent idea.
Yeah, and then we'll just take it in pieces as we go through the process.
Very large, yeah.
Yeah, if the Public Protection Committee is interested in updating the code, if you're not, we can continue to enforce it the way that it has been. But I don't want to spend any more staff time on this if we're going to get to this point, and the answer is going to simply be no. So I would like some type of direction tonight from the Public Protection Committee.
Well, I would like to make a couple points about some of, not just the definitions of things, so that's something you can look into while you're
Sure.
come back at it, that I'm really glad about a lot of better explanation on what things are considered what. So like the lawns, those kind of things, that we needed to have more clarification, but I was, again, I'm going to have a hard time with recreational vehicles. You have 3 or more, and I'm not even happy with 3. If that's going to keep someone from living in town, because they can't have 3 of them, we have small lots. It's not fair to the other neighbors when there's, the percentage of people that have the recreational vehicles is much smaller than the average of the whole city. And so when you're looking at that, we're putting in all these extra things. I don't mind us we talked about putting, where you had to have hard surface alongside of someone's driveway so they could put a car there if they needed to, or a recreational vehicle. I'm fine with that, and that's up in the front, it's visible. But I don't want to see somebody then starting to, okay, now I'm going to put how many more things in the backyard on soft surface where the oil leaking into. I just don't understand why we're doing that kind of stuff for people. If you have the money to afford to have recreational vehicles, I understand one thing, but if there's more than one and you can't maintain it in your own property so it doesn't affect other people, then you should do why we have places that are storage areas. And I'm sorry, but I have to do that for a boat we have. And I don't feel it would be fair for me to stick my boat out there and make people have to look at that all year round. There's many people have come to me that have said people have boats that are in their back of their yard, and all of a sudden there's water in there. And I know you're at least looking at that as being that they have to have not just tarps, but specifically fitted, and I appreciate that so much, Mark. that is so good to see. But again, these people have had it for ages. The neighbors are uncomfortable approaching their neighbor and complaining about something. That's not easy to do. And so if you don't have it as an ordinance, then it gets taken advantage of, and then one person sees it and other people think it. These people ended up having raccoons in town, in their yard, which they were worried were going to bite their dog, which could give their dog rabies or whatever. I mean, I just see we've had a lot of infestation of things inside our city, of rats and rodents that are pretty big that I've seen running across the road. And then people tell me there's raccoons. This is all inside town. And to have things that are just sitting out just for the few, I'm sorry, I just don't think we should have 3 recreational vehicles that are allowed to be out in someone's property that the neighbors have to deal with.
Sure. Yeah, and again, I would, if we're not ready to dive into this, and I'm definitely getting the sense from the Public Protection Committee that maybe we're not ready for this, let us to go back, let's make some revisions to the definitions, and let's bring it back to you guys in chunks, so that it's more tangible and something we can deal with. But again, it sounds like there's an interest in pursuing this, some type of amendment. There's a lot of information in this chapter that maybe we aren't ready to discuss tonight at this meeting.
It's
So-
too much for this meeting
Sure.
right now. If we take it to midnight, and then we wouldn't get to the tourist rooming houses.
Right, which is another discussion. So I'm more than happy
But I
to.
do want to make sure that it's said that, like the tarps and other things that Mark has done to clarify are excellent. Really, they really are excellent, and we need them. And
Yeah.
I appreciate the work that has been done.
One, so I think I have some fundamental disagreements with my colleagues on the committee, but first off, I think if this is before us tonight, this is exactly the public forum where we should be contributing our input, so if there's if you want to go back and work on it, I don't know with what intentions, and if you want that to come through us via phone calls and emails, I think this is exactly a forum where we should be able to discuss it. So I am prepared to be here to midnight if we need to be. I don't really think it'll go that far, but I think that that there should at least be a conversation as well as a public opportunity. So if you don't mind, I can go into some of those thoughts that I have.
And I would welcome that because I really don't feel, I guess we've gotten good direction. You know, Cindy, to go back to the issue with the RVs, just to remind everybody, right now, you can have as many as you want parked anywhere on your property. So we're going to 3. That's a pretty big step forward. And I know from a lot of people's perspective, it may not be, but there's a lot of people who live in the city that think that's going to be an infringement on their property rights. Whether that's right or wrong, you can debate that all night long, okay? We came up with that number through a lot of discussion between myself and the zoning administrator. The idea is not to enact something that's going to affect, you know, half of the population of the city of Stevens Point. It's something that's going to affect the minority of the people that have cluttered situations, that when you look at them, you can see they're cluttered, but really within a code definition, we don't have anything to kind of enforce that. Again, you know, RVs, grills, even the natural lawn. Right now, there's nothing in our ordinance that allows you to have a natural lawn. So from a code perspective, all the people that have these beautiful natural lawns and native plantings, I can potentially go out there and say, no, you have to cut all that down. That's ridiculous. So we do need to make some modifications in this
and
code.
that's
And
what I
any
said.
guidance I can get would be greatly appreciated.
I know you're looking for the guidance.
That is why I said I like what you did. I just don't like 3 in an area when we have small lots. So it needs to be, I think it needs to be defined more on the idea of how big your lot is, the number that you could have.
I think it's important to also know that Mark did a survey on all of these items and got a pretty good response, didn't you? So a lot of this is based on what the public has already
Correct.
told him. Not us necessarily, but we do.
It didn't get out to as many people as I think it needed to.
Yeah. Well, we have some public members here now. We might give them an opportunity if they would like to speak about public maintenance
Sure.
violations.
That's a good idea.
Anybody? Come on up.
this is not what I came for, but I'm curious.
Could you let us know your name and?
Oh, I'm sorry. Pam Skoleski, 644th Avenue. I guess my thought was, when you say recreational vehicles, is it just motorized vehicles, or is it kayaks versus RVs? Mark?
It doesn't include kayaks. So I can give you the definition. If you want to take a look at it,
Okay.
you have an extra copy.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, and again, I probably have that downloaded. And as for raccoons, we do have raccoons. And I don't have any of this stuff in my yard, and it's only 50 feet wide. But I'm wondering if there isn't a solution, if it's, I'm sorry to compare it to student housing, but, I mean, you have to have so many square feet for a license, you know? I mean, if you got a $250,000 RV, or 2 or 3, I guess, on your 50-foot lot, that would definitely impede on your neighbors. But I'm wondering if there couldn't be some, I hate to say more regulations, but regulations saying, you know, you can only have this kind, you know, and if you're covered it up right and got your little wheel covers on it and all that, and it's not bothering anybody. But I've also seen, I've been in real estate a long time, I've seen it all. And I'm wondering if there couldn't be some, you know, individual, you know, sorry, the words are escaping me right now, but I think it really depends on what kind of the RV. I've seen the pop-up campers that are sunk into the ground 10 inches because they've been there for 20 years. That's an issue. So maybe they have to be moved once a year, something like that, or not just 10 feet like the railroads, you know, but just my thought.
Good point, thanks. Anybody else like to speak to this? Yes?
Is this for comments on the
Yes, comment, and, yeah.
Is it about firewood too?
It could be, yeah, that's part of it.
All of chapter 21.
Let us know your name and address.
Yep, Dan Theis, 600 Portage Street, Stevens Point. So I guess I'm coming to voice my concern about firewood. I cut firewood for exercise and to be more environmentally sustainable. I realize that I look up sometimes and I see the gas coming out, and I see like, well, I'm burning natural gas. It might be more pleasant to the air, but only maybe, you know, visually or to your nose, but maybe not to your health or long run type thing. And I think that when we're talking about firewood regulation, I feel that it's almost like we're trying to regulate disorder, and I feel that disorder should be regulated rather than the size or the technique. I noticed that there was like a proposal for like a 6-foot high stack of wood, and if you know anything about stacking wood, which there's like libraries on this topic about the most effective, the best method, and if you limit and restrict a technique that people have been doing ever since the dawn of humans, right, you're going to limit success. And for example, there's ways to stack wood. If you've seen them, they're beautiful. It's like art sometimes where they make it nice and tall, and those are really efficient, some people might say. And so I think that disorder of like how long can you have a firewood pile not stacked, I think would be a better order. And if you limit the size, you're going to potentially increase the surface area in which Stevens Point has firewood. And that's going to like compound the problem, right? Potentially. I'm sure there's not many people around with really tall stacks of firewood, but I'm just saying that there are techniques that I've actually been thinking about implementing, this ancient technique like of stacking wood a certain particular way, and now all of a sudden I will be forced to be, so to speak, more inefficient. And I don't think that that should be the regulation. I think the regulation should be more focused on how long you're allowed to have logs or lumber or whatever in a disorderly fashion on your property, rather than tell us how to do it. And that's just kind of my opinion. Yes.
I just wanted to ask you a question. So I think what they're trying to get at more is the safety of like that it's not so high that some people don't know what they're doing, and they're just stacking them, and then it can fall over on a child or person or someone's building.
A raccoon.
Or a raccoon.
Right.
Yeah, and I do like raccoons, but anyway, so I think that was probably mostly the reason. So what would you think is, or what do you have for size-wise of yours as a normal that you feel like it's really safe and it wouldn't fall?
Yeah, I mean, there's some of my stacks of firewood, there's houses in Stevens Point, they're gonna fall over before my firewood does.
Yeah. I believe that.
And I don't, and there's already a restriction on the property line, and we already have, there's already laws on trespassing.
Right.
And so I don't, and I understand there's a concern about 6 feet and safety and things. I get that, but people can stack firewood in a safe manner. There's also an art component to it. You can Google art and firewood stacking, and there's a whole thing out there that potentially would be restricted, the expression of, hey, you know, a task and showing off that you can create art simultaneously with getting exercise and being environmentally responsible. And I would no longer be able to make that statement to the world. And I don't think that's fair, inhibiting my expression that way. I feel that disorder, again, like if you have a big pile of smorgasbord of wood, I mean, the clock should start ticking. Your neighbor wants to take a picture of it in your yard, go ahead, snap a picture, here's the date, it's time-stamped. And then, you know, if an X period of time goes by and the disorder is not taken care of, you know, then you have a problem. And so that's just what I'd like to say.
And I understand what you're saying too, and just the fact about, about people trespassing. Children don't always pay attention to that, they don't understand, and that's why there's regulations throughout the country, throughout, anyway, the United States, for if you have a pool, you have to have a fence around it. There's certain things, even with our beehives, we've had something where it had to be back so far so that it wouldn't be noticeable to draw attention to it from the street for kids or whatever. So I just want you to understand a little bit of why they're looking at this, but I do get it, because my brother is a lumberjack guy, and he loves chopping wood all the time.
There's a technique of stacking firewood where you stack it like this, like like basically when you start a teepee campfire, and it just gets really big. And the effect of it is that air rises when it gets warm, and it comes in at the bottom, and it creates a natural chimney. So you have a big, massive chimney. And for a chimney to work, you need draft, you need delta, you need change between what's happening down below and what's happening up above. So the taller the pile, the more efficient it is. Therefore, this law would take away from the effectiveness of one technique of stacking firewood. Not to mention, you know, a couple other things. And I feel that fundamentally, I get it in the safety. And I mean, you wouldn't be able to knock over one of those piles and be like, you can take a whole, you know, a group of kindergartners and be like, try all day long, you'll never be able to knock it over. Right, so that's just my opinion, so.
Thanks. Thanks for your input.
Yeah, thank you.
Anybody else? Yes.
Warren Jacobson, 1579 Church Street. I have a couple issues. I want to start on process. I think I'm a little uncomfortable with the process starting with the prior director, Ostrowski, asking for a staff member who's actually tasked with enforcement of this ordinance to go and revise the entire ordinance pretty substantially, as there's a little bit of a balance that's intended to be affected by this governmental system, where the ordinances actually come from you as the alder people, and then the staff members tasked with carrying out those ordinances are doing so at your bequest, hired by you. So to have these ordinances coming, really, it sounds like almost exclusively from staff and from staff experience, without any particular alderperson asking with requests from their constituents for these changes to take place. And maybe I'm hearing that a couple of them, Alderperson Nebel and Alderperson Dugan, are coming, but comprehensively it sure doesn't seem that way. I don't think the International Property Maintenance Code is really an important starting place for this community. And I'm concerned that the problems that are articulated are problems that we're attacking in all the wrong way, particularly as this proposed code continues the new normal, which isn't really that old, where we have people pounding the pavement, drumming up ordinance violations without any community member actually making a call and saying that something's wrong. So whereas maybe maybe I'm okay with some of these ordinance proposals being in, that if someone is really concerned about something happening on a property and they make a complaint, that we might come in and take care of it. But even as you described that maybe this is a minority that's going to be affected, the new normal has been that we've got a whole fleet of people who are now going around town drumming up ordinances that nobody's complained about. And that's a significant concern to me. Going to the substance that's being proposed here, you know, I think it's disheartening for me to hear that it's being proposed that we should have a grass standard coupled with the idea that we don't have the liberty here on our properties to have native landscaping if it's not granted to us by the ordinance. I think it needs to come the other way around. The ordinance should specifically and in a limited way restrict those things that we know and have demonstrated cause some kind of issue with properties and with neighbors. And I think the restriction that's being added to here that goes above and beyond what we've had for a long time in this community has not been demonstrated to really deal with those issues, raccoons, rats, etc. We've been enforcing a 9-inch standard that didn't exist. We heard here today the very staff member who's been enforcing that standard saying that we didn't have that standard in the first place. I think there is a disconnect between the role that the alder people that you, I believe, are tasked to establish these ordinances and to maintain them, and then to task the staff with carrying them out. I think we've got it backwards, and that needs to be addressed. I would ask the alder people to direct the staff to discontinue work on this comprehensive package and only work on those aspects on those changes that you actually have constituents coming here and asking you for. I think this comprehensive package is a majority things that constituents are not asking for, and I haven't heard anyone actually bringing up that is taking place. And if we have a backward system where constituents are asking the staff to change the laws and that other people aren't hearing about it, then I think it's your duty to correct that, as the city staff should be asking people to contact their alder people if they would like these ordinances to be changed. Now, back to the first topic that you were talking about, definitions. If you look at our state statutes, for example, there are definitions throughout the state statutes, and often they are different with a particular purpose. Because when you're talking about one topic, a specific term might take on a different meaning. Just because it's a word doesn't mean that it should mean the same thing when you're talking about different types of laws. And so as the staff is suggesting, remove the definitions section in the property maintenance code because there are similar terms defined elsewhere. I'm uncomfortable just hearing that there's already been an effort to homogenize those definitions across different parts of the code, as for a long time those different definitions have meant that those codes did different things. And by homogenizing them, we're kind of arbitrarily, just for this idea of homogeneous definitions, actually changing the codes throughout. Mr. Cordes talked about there maybe being confusion about which definition applies. I think it's pretty clear that if you're in the property maintenance code, that the definitions that are in the property maintenance code are the ones that apply. And that it's not that confusing, if you go off into a different part of the code and read a similar definition. It would be a stretch for you to try to cherry pick that separate definition. When in the future, other people on this committee are considering changes, the maintenance to and the enforcement of this code, it's important that the very definitions of the terms that you use are also under your purview. And so to essentially give up the definition of the words that you're going to approve that then will be enforced by staff to another committee that is considering those definitions for a completely different purpose, I think is irresponsible. I think it would be appropriate for there to be definitions maintained in every single chapter, as there largely are at this point in time. And further, I think it's absolutely okay for those definitions to be slightly different as they apply to a different set of codes. That comes back to this very idea of whose responsibility is it to write and to maintain these ordinances, and it's yours. And so if the staff is coming with a restructuring of the very way that you're going to organize the codes that you're responsible for making the decisions on, for changing, and for tasking the staff with carrying out, that restructuring should come at your request and not be something that's brought that then you're kind of dealing with and saying, okay, maybe we should homogenize this. There are unintended consequences of that. I don't think those unintended consequences are really played out in this proposal, and I'm concerned about that entire process carrying out. I would prefer to see resolutions coming from older people for changes that are requested by their constituents, or that maybe are the very reasons they ran in the first place, and that staff do work on proposing ordinance language when you request that they do so, and not when arbitrarily, a prior director has decided that the codes that his department is tasked with enforcing, that he wants to update them, to change them, to match with the enforcement that he would like to be carried out without a single alderperson requesting it. Thank you.
Sure. Okay. We've had a lot of contribution. Yes. Alder Johnson.
So, thank you for the opportunity. Melissa Johnson, District 5 Council President. That's my nighttime job, my daytime job. I'm staff to Marathon County. So the Scott Walker model of how staff should behave is just as the former speaker indicated, that DNR or the Department of Health and Human Services or the Department of Revenue, Department of Licensing had no opinion. The professional staff who is expert in these things was not allowed to bring forward ideas or policy proposals for policymakers to consider. It absolutely eviscerated those agencies. In the past, under many different administrations, DNR, and that's who I work with most closely, so I'll use that, DNR was seen as an expectation based on their expertise and what they see in the field and the challenges of regulating the regulated. They were expected to bring forward these policy proposals and work with the policymakers, the legislators, to make sure that not only administrative code but statute was reflecting the needs of the people of Wisconsin. For 8 years, I watched my colleagues at the DNR silenced. It was an abomination to see those good people not be able to express an opinion or provide their professional technical expertise. So, in my daytime job as well, my board looks for me to bring them information as it relates to policies they should be working on. They are not experts in the world of solid waste management, though they've been working hard to understand. So this is a two-way street. This isn't a one-way street. This is hand-in-hand working together, listening to the public and listening to our experts who understand what we're doing. So I completely disagree with the former speaker. I think there's a role for both. I do very strongly understand the distinction between policymaking and operations. Once my board has made a policy decision, I then execute it. And I report back with measurements on how well or how it failed. So we have to understand that these are joint endeavors. And absolutely, policymakers should be bringing forward ideas. They should be reflecting the needs of their citizens or the challenges they're facing in their districts. But it shouldn't be the sole or lone opportunity for advancing policy that will help a community. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further discussion here on the committee? Oh, we have another person. All right.
My name is Alison, 600 Portage Street, and I'd like to express my concern about the vegetation management plan for a lawn and just regulating somebody, and it feels a little offensive when you read it, and I guess I'm wondering too why it was put in there in the first place, and I'd like to feel like I have ownership where I live and what I can create. When I read some of that language, I didn't feel that way. And so I think it's just too much regulation on what somebody does in their lawn. But can you tell me a little about why that was proposed? The vegetation?
Sure.
Okay.
Because we have nothing in the ordinance that would allow you to have a natural lawn.
Okay. Okay.
And there was nothing in there that would allow you to have it, so really it was
Oh.
put in there for your benefit.
Oh, okay. All right.
Otherwise, I could literally have the city contractor come there and mow everything down if you had a natural lawn.
Oh, really? Okay. All
I
right.
mean, per the code, you know.
Okay. So it's to promote more native?
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely.
All right. Thanks.
Okay, anybody else? It is probably time to turn to a motion, and it looks...
Well, I think this committee has further discussion, so,
Well, yeah.
or at least I have other items that I
I
would
asked you
like
if you
to-
wanted more discussion.
Okay, yeah. Well, I think getting into the substance of this, I do agree that some of it it definitely does not come from the agreement and issues that I've heard from my constituents, and a lot of the things that match here actually contradict opinions and preferences of residents in my own district. And so I do have some issues with those. The vegetative management plan is one example where if we're looking at trying to improve this code, the plan itself requires a statement of purpose. If an individual submits a plan and the purpose is to provide habitat for pollinators, which are insects, further in the code, it says that no person shall allow vegetative matter which harbors insects. So then are we giving staff the right to deny that vegetative management plan because it still is in conflict? And I think that's where it comes to, is just that the method for trying to address some of these issues still creates contradictories within the code itself. And those are the things that even this body has discussed within the last year that I've been a part of the council, and I think in prior meetings, that we have actually pointed out some of those contradictories, and those are the issues that I've been trying to bring up as people come here to appeal, where the communication from yourself about the violations is really unclear. And I understand that some of it is the ambiguity here, but some of it is the contradictory nature. Like, there isn't an actual enforcement that you would have to mow their plants because there wasn't a height maintenance, nor were those noxious weeds. And so the public nuisance thing really is the one that it came down to, and that is a pretty broad and ambiguous use, and I don't think people would consider flowers to be a public nuisance. Maybe someone does, and I think that's what it gets to, and the more that you try to put parameters on those issues, I think the more that I tend to feel you should, if you want a specific standard for your neighborhood, perhaps you should move into a subdivision where your neighborhood is then monitoring, and I don't think that's your role. I don't fund your job in the budget as with the consideration that that is your primary purpose, but rather education, which we've talked about as a body in the budget discussions, that we want your role to be focused more on the education and improving neighborhoods. And I know I've discussed this with you before about neighborhood resolution programs, where instead of when we have anonymous complaints against neighbors, working ways to resolve these relationships, which from my perspective does a lot more to improve neighborhoods than finding ways that we can pinch and squeeze the neighbors to a maintenance standard that perhaps one neighbor wants to impose on another. And I think that's where it gets complicated. It doesn't make your job any easier to have to kind of tiptoe around those specific issues.
So I can offer a couple of examples. Actually, one of the speakers that got up here is a pointer, or the point he was trying to make was, how was this driven? I can tell you all of this was driven from complaints. There wasn't anything I went out and said, I think this is something we should start enforcing. This was 100% all driven by complaints that came into our office. And the other issue is, I don't disagree with you on natural lawns. I think it's something we want to encourage in the city. But here's the other thing I have to wrestle with, is I have somebody with a perfectly manicured lawn, I have somebody with a pollinator lawn. This just happened last year. And they were at each other's throats all summer long. And I asked for a plan, which she gladly provided. Well, didn't gladly provide, but she provided. I said, you know what, she has a plan. She's complying with it. I'm okay with it. End of story from my perspective. But really, there's nothing in code. So, I agree. We want to regulate as little as possible. Most of this is driven by those situations where neighbors are at each other's throat, and I want to defend the person that has the native plantings. Now, that being said, I go out to properties, and they say, it's a natural lawn. Well, they're just letting everything grow up. It's not a natural lawn. There's a big difference between people that actually maintain a pollinator yard. And I've heard that, and I've seen the difference between a pollinator yard and people that just call me, it's a pollinator yard. So it's holding them to a certain level of responsibility. The idea is this plant would be very basic and very simple. I can show you the ones that have been submitted in my office. They're not complicated.
Yeah, I've seen some of those.
Yeah, they're not complicated at all. So if somebody is going to say, I want to have a natural lawn, what I'm saying is that's fine, that's great. submit something to me, so when your neighbor who's, maintaining his lawn perfectly and, fertilizing it and cutting it so it's not ever higher than 4 inches and is complaining about your lawn, I can say, hey, he submitted his plan, it's approved, he's within the conditions of his natural lawn or his native lawn. So I understand, trust me, even though my job is enforcement, I want to enforce as lightly and as little as possible. If we would have went the way of the property maintenance code, you'd be dealing with something that was literally 4 to 5 times as thick as this 29-page document you're looking at. So what I tried to do is fill in the gaps, and now you don't have to agree with me on these things, and I do not take it personally. So I really, this is all good input. Even everybody that came up here and spoke, the gentleman with the firewood, I never thought of that. I learned something tonight. But also, think of this. We're here for health and safety, okay? And the welfare of the general public. So he can stack firewood good, but you know what? How hard is it to shovel a sidewalk? But how many people can't do it right?
That's right.
So think about all of a sudden you have a 12-foot high stack of firewood at a property line, and somebody doesn't know what they're doing. That's a hazard. He may know what he's doing, but we can't be sure that everybody's going to know what they're doing. Now, the fact he talked about that made me think there are things we can do. We can create a fall zone like you do for a cell tower. If they're going to have a 30-foot high, you got to have a fall zone. So ultimately, if you want to have a high stack of firewood, I can write that into the ordinance. I can create something that would allow him to stack his firewood as he wants, but still protect public safety. Had he not said that, I would have never thought of it. So, all this input is really good input, and this can be incorporated into the code, and this is why we need to have meetings like this and discussions like this. And it's not that we all have to agree with each other. Now, that being said, if I can get a little guidance, if we can go through this as quickly maybe as possible, and you can just give me some general thoughts as to what you're feeling, and I can try to, go back and make those changes. And as Ryan suggested, we'll just bring it back piecemeal. But if I can get a little bit of guidance to go through it, I'd really appreciate that, if that's okay.
This is just a starting point.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I would like to see you do exactly what you recommended, that you would take it piecemeal, that you would do some adjustments. And we've heard a lot of interesting input here tonight from committee members as well as the public watchers. Now, how do we create that? Do we want to call for some sort of motion or a postponement?
I think we can just take no action.
Yeah, I suppose we can.
I would like to propose that we bring this back in sections,
Yeah, I would too. I'm not sure how.
because I think there's so many great things in here, and it's just so hard and overwhelming. And I do think explanations that you've given are helpful, and each time we do something like this is a huge, important chapter
Yeah.
for our city and for our residents. And so to be able to have everybody have a chance to be able to be part of that, I mean, you guys have done a lot of work, and I don't want that just to be thrown away.
Yeah.
So I would like it to come back, and let's start with just terminology, if
Okay.
that's what it is.
All right.
What should stay in, do we think needs to stay in, and then into some of the other things, because I do think you've got a lot of good things in here, and we do need some of these changed.
And maybe, are there some areas that require more specifics than others? Instead of, maybe some areas could be broader, and some areas require more specifics based on maybe the number of complaints that you've had surrounding certain things. But I know it's hard to get into
It's really
too
hard.
many specifics.
It's really hard so from a code standpoint, I understand nobody wants rules and regulations. I get it. I get it. Nobody wants to get a letter from me. I understand that. I'm at peace with that, trust me. But that being said, a lot of what is in here is only for a couple % of people that are in the city. And it's, again, those few people. And if you're writing something that's going to affect 50 or more % of the people, it's going to create an outcry. So I would exercise caution in the RV language, because that's a touchy subject. And that's going to probably be an issue all on its own to deal with. The native lawns, I appreciate that. I will try to simplify that language. My hope is that we're going to encourage that, not discourage that.
Yeah, I think that's nice.
Yeah, would someone like to make some sort of motion?
I'd like to make a motion that we come back with just in sections, if possible, and
And I would
continue.
second that. Any discussion? Yeah.
Do you want to make it more specific? Do you want him to come back next month with the first, do you want to just say come back month by month with sections, or
Would you like to add that?
would you, a friendly amendment? Because otherwise he could come back next year, I don't know.
No.
If you want.
The other thing is, like, what exactly do you want him to specifically work on? Because it's hard for us to just say, bring it back to us,
yeah.
but you're like, well,
Can I offer a suggestion?
Sure,
Maybe we
sure.
come back with definitions next month, and maybe we preview the following month, and you give me a little guidance on it.
Yeah, good idea. I like that.
Could we add something more into the whole thing with the RVs? I know you're saying this is going to be a big issue, but I still think it has to be according to square footage of what you have as a yard. I mean, I go down Michigan Avenue, I cannot believe how many vehicles and snowmobiles and things that are off
Yep.
right in the front.
Yeah,
and
so.
It's like ridiculous.
What I would suggest is this, when we get to that section, it's not that much work for me to write a couple different versions of that section of the code.
Okay.
And you can take a look at it and see what you like. You may want to combine multiple sections, but I can write it a couple different ways. You can take a look at it. Also, from an enforcement standpoint, I'm going to tell you, some may be much more difficult to enforce. They may be difficult for the average person to even understand, what they mean. So I think that's important too. We're more in tune with what's going on, how big our lot is, what's a front yard setback, rear yard setback. The average person doesn't know what that means. They don't know what the right-of-way is, things like that. So we have to be a little careful in how we draft things and how we word them so the average person can understand this from an enforcement
For the
standpoint.
layperson.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you. Yes. Well, I think we've got a motion, have we not? You'll bring it forward piece by piece each month. Well, shall I call for, we got a motion, we got a second? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
And any opposed, nay? No. 4-0, passes. Well done. Now we're on to our fourth agenda item. And it's a discussion-only item. We don't have to be concerned about whether we can move or not. This discussion item is about tourist rooming houses, fine structure for violations of the ordinance. Now, for those people who are listening or watching, tourist rooming house is our version of what lots of people call Airbnbs, VRBOs, short-term rentals, home away, stay away. We have an ordinance amendment that deals with tourist rooming houses. Let me give you, those of you who don't know, just a quick summary of the history, the city's history with tourist rooming houses and the regulations that we've considered. Really, only recently. We started talking about this in 2016. One of our tourist people out of the convention and tourist, what is that called? Really encouraged us. This is happening all over the country, actually all over the world, and it's an opportunity for us, and people are going to want to rent their houses out completely or portions of their houses to people. So we began to discuss that in 2016. We decided to start with the multifamily zoning districts, that's R4 and R5, before considering the single and two-family districts. Now, in 2016, no action was taken. We just began talking about it and began understanding what it all was. In 2017, the city adopted a tourist rooming house code and made tourist rooming houses a conditional use in multifamily districts. And those are the residential districts. That would be 4 and 5, and that's what we talked about in 2016. 2 years later, just last year, in 2019, the city approved an ordinance amendment to allow tourist rooming houses as a permitted use when owner occupied, and a conditional use when the owner did not live on site. we were concerned that things might be a little bit better ordered and maintained if the owner lived there. At first, only the R3 single and two-family zoning districts were considered, but finally, all single-family residential districts, that's R2, R1, RLD, that's low density, they were all included. That's Chapter 23.02. In other words, last year's tourist rooming houses were approved for every city residential neighborhood. That's our history. And here are the regulations, very quickly. Wisconsin law requires a license for a tourist rooming house. It has its code. Portage County actually enforces it. The county's Health and Human Services Department performs an initial inspection to assure that protection of the guests in the house, and they issue the license. So protections like, is there a carbon monoxide detector? How's the furnace working? Is the plumbing okay? So that's what we did with that was the Wisconsin law, and the county is overseeing that. Now, taxes. In Stevens Point, well, all over the state, if you have a tourist rooming house, there's a state sales tax that you need to pay. And there's a city room tax that we required the owner to pay. In addition, the owner must pay a fee for that county's health and safety inspection that I mentioned in the licensing part of this. Finally, owner occupancy. As described, when an owner occupies a house, he or she may apply to the city for a permit. That's a pretty definite thing. And a conditional use when non-owner occupied. So that's kind of the background. And what we want to do is discuss, I guess we need to discuss, do we have a lot of tourist rooming houses in the area? Well, yes, we do in the area, but how about in Stevens Point? How many are there? How many are legal? How many aren't? And if they're not complying, although they know the laws, what sort of fine structure should we create? And that's something that Alder Nabel has brought up and might want to talk about for a moment.
I just happened to get a call and a letter, and I think almost all of us did, that there was a property that was operating as a rooming house, and, I'm sorry, tourist rooming house.
Yeah.
And from what it looked like from their ads, they don't live in the state, they live in Texas, so it's not owner occupied. And it looked like they'd been doing this, so at least from the advertising, since September. And so it's quite a long time for them not to have been paying the taxes and making sure they have a permit for it. So I checked into that and got a hold of staff, and they looked into it, and they said they had already been aware of this and had already issued a notice to the person. My thought was, well, someone does this, how do you keep somebody from continuing to say, well, wait till we'll worry about it when someone catches us, attitude. And so I thought that there needed to be something that would deter somebody from just letting it go until they got caught, and would make a difference on, be better off just to get your permit and make sure you're doing it legally, instead of maybe incurring a cost every month for not having it. That was my point, bringing that forward. I just think it's important, if we're going to have licensing, we've already had problems with rental licensing, which is now not, we're not able to do anything on making sure that their safety or anything issued to inspections to them. But we have it yet still for this. I think that'll come someday, and we won't have it either.
Well, that's Wisconsin state law.
Yeah, so we'll see what happens, but I'm hoping that we can look at I know, I don't want to bring up who the person was, but what happens with that kind of situation when someone's been doing it for a long period of time and they've been making quite a good amount of money off of it. So, do we have any structure at all on?
Yeah.
I didn't think I saw that in our.
Sure. Sure, yeah, so tourist rooming houses are regulated under the zoning code, and the zoning code does specifically call out land use violations. The city staff zoning administrator, Kyle, as the city's official zoning administrator, can essentially fine someone who's in violation of a use up to $500 per instance. Obviously, our goal, just like the nuisance violations, is that we try to work towards compliance. And that's really,
That's all you can do.
yeah, that's
all you
really
can
what we
hope
try
for.
to do. We don't want to be levying or issuing citations of $500 a day, for example, to someone who's in a use violation that's working towards compliance. As it currently exists, so when we talk about the fee structure, know that there already is some mechanism for the city to issue fines if someone's not working to come into compliance. The specific example that's cited in this packet, the day that we were notified by a number of the property owners that this was occurring, we did notify the property owner, and he did the next day submit his conditional use permit request, and that'll be on the March agenda. And the neighbors will be properly notified as required by our ordinance and by state statute for conditional use permits. And so that's coming down the pipeline. Because they're working to come into compliance, staff did not state that they had to cease all operations. There were no police complaints at the property. There's been no fire or EMS complaints at the property. And so we felt as though it wasn't this major neighborhood hindrance. And plus, they were working to come into compliance with the conditional use permit process. As we go and we discover or we look into possibilities of improving tourist rooming house regulations, a lot of these are outside of the purview of the Public Protection Committee, and those really should go to the Plan Commission for consideration. So if we're only here to talk about the fines and enforcement thereof,
Right.
know that there already is a mechanism that staff can utilize to enforce the zoning code if it's in violation. Again, the specific property owner working towards coming into compliance, staff doesn't feel comfortable issuing citations for this use violation.
So then we lose the taxes that, I guess, bothers me is that this is something that we did a while back ago, and so at any time someone violates it,
Sure.
there should be the fine. So now he gets told that, well, because he got caught, they don't get a fine. We don't do that with other situations for
Right.
people, and
Part of that collection of the sales and use tax goes back on the states. When they go get their state permit, they will have to remit that past tax. And the city can also tack on the room tax that we do have. I will state that as of January 1, 2019, Wisconsin Act 10 does require that Airbnb, VRBO, they are responsible for collecting sales and use tax and room tax and remitting it from the property owner to the city, for example, or to the county. So there is mechanisms. This is a changing economy. This is a very different than what we've been dealing with in the last 20 years, for example. But as the tourist rooming houses change and it comes into the city of Stevens Point, we can address these as we go on, and the state's kind of catching up as well. So staff's very comfortable with how we've been enforcing it. We will do more in terms of checking VRBO, Airbnb, other sites like that to make sure that there is compliance. And of course, if there's complaints, we'll definitely follow up on those as well, so.
Can you tell me, Director, approximately how many legal Airbnbs we have and how many non-complying in Point?
In Point, we don't have a lot of non-compliant. A lot of the VRBOs or Airbnbs are owner-occupied, which is permitted in our zoning ordinance. Ridge House is the one that's the biggest one that's not in compliance right now. There might be one or two others, but it's not a crisis. For example, I'd like to say that there's no such thing as an emergency in zoning and planning, right? So these are things that we can address as the year goes on, and we'll definitely do a more diligent job of looking on those websites, making sure that there are non-owner occupied, that they are getting the proper licensing and permits
So
from
you
the
are
city.
doing that now regularly?
The last time that we were on the website was August, and
Yeah.
so it's,
Maybe a little bit more.
yes, yep, and that
Yeah.
is something that, Kyle and I and others in the department will be
Good.
addressing.
Good. If this continues to grow, I think we need to possibly talk about it again, because I'm concerned about neighborhood stability. If we've got some big houses that can ask, or allow 10, 12, and 16 people in them, they're not that big. But if that's happening in more neighborhoods, and the person you were talking about was offering, 16 people to come to his 3-bedroom house. So that's an egregious sort of act. But I don't think it happens very often or in very many neighborhoods.
No, most of the VRBOs are, I would say, between 1 and 4 individuals.
Yeah.
We don't see the Kaufman House on the corner of Division and Main is a larger home. They are authorized to have more than 4 individuals.
Right.
A lot of that is also based on VRBO Airbnb standards as well.
Yeah.
But as part of the conditional use permit, you could put that requirement in, but it has to be the non-owner occupied.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's when you get the opportunity to set that standard.
That's a good idea.
So.
Yeah.
Do we currently limit the amount of days people can stay there or not? Is that not established?
No, we do not limit that.
Any other committee member who'd like to speak on this topic?
I like the idea of limiting the number of people depending on the size of the house. I think that's pretty important.
Right, and that comes back to the plan commission when they review, and ultimately the city council does have the final say on conditional use permits, so.
It would be good to bring some of this back to maybe the Plan Commission for some discussion.
If we
Yeah.
want to do that, how do we do that? That would be my
I would
question.
have a conversation with the chairman of the plan commission.
Okay, thanks. Thank you.
Okay, how about anyone here in the public? Come and speak and state your name and address, please.
Ruth Piffner, 708 Ridge Road, and I live across the street from the house that you're all talking about. I just happened to have a booking report that the owner actually submitted. I think you all have it. But it was so hard to read. I was with a magnifying glass. And just to let you know about the numbers, these are already booked. Some of them have already happened. Starting from January 17th, there were 6 adults. 2 adults, that's the very smallest, that was for one night. 9 people, 6 people, 7 adults plus 2 children, 8 adults, 6 adults, 5 plus 2, that means 5 adults, 2 children, 8, 5 plus 4, 8 plus 2 plus 2, which it means 2 infants, and I guess they stay free. So there's 12 there. And then another 8 plus 2, and then a 6. So the numbers are high. It is a 3-bedroom home, and that you can find on the assessment, the property assessment. It's a 3-bedroom home.
Which means that if people are in the basement sleeping, there's no egress window.
There are no egress windows or doors there. And one of the rooms they're talking about is, a sleeping room. So, I think I better just get back to, I wanted to say some other things, so maybe I'll cover that. There is a lot of incorrect information on his listing on Airbnb. So right away, we have the number of bedrooms is incorrect, the number of bathrooms is incorrect. I have a problem with that because then I think, well, shouldn't they be taxed? If he's saying there's 4 bedrooms, then, well, let's get that taxed on 4 bedrooms and 4 baths, and there's really two full, 2 half. Those are small things. But anyway, they advertise for 10 people. And in the agenda notes, the different papers that were included, he did have a conversation between himself and a gentleman from Chicago. And the gentleman from Chicago wanted to book the place for mid-June for a golf outing with first 10 of his friends, 10 in total. And then he said, oh, no, I changed that to 12. And then the owner said, oh, that would be fine because we have an air mattress and we have a futon. So already, now we're up to 12. Then the conversation continued and the man in Chicago said, oh, I just found out there's 16. So now we're up to 16 people. And the interesting thing is, this was from a screenshot. There's no more conversation shown. This was all from email. So that conversation ended. So we can't see what the response was to 16. And I guess I feel that it was probably yes. That's why it's not there. So that, I mean, that is very troublesome to me, that here I am in a very nice, quiet neighborhood. It's a generational neighborhood, actually, because there's several people who've grown up there, then they come back after they're married, they start families. So it's that kind of a neighborhood. I guess I feel that a conditional use permit for a TRH in this location should, not even exist. I just feel that it changes so much. This is not a hotel, and I've been there since 1977, and it just seems like, wow, all of these, all of this stuff. I feel that those of us, then there's so many that have been there for so long, we shouldn't have to change for one person who's only been there for 2 years. I mean, that's like, okay, I just don't see that. So anyway, I have a few other things here. I did hear what was said about, the fact that he's not being fined or anything. He can continue his rentals, even though he now knows he's not in compliance. And I think that's, I mean, I can't imagine any inspection ever being accepted for him to do this. That part I just don't ever understand. When you are seeing 3 bedrooms, how could he get an acceptance? So that's what I look at it and I think, well, how do we then say, but that's okay for you to continue on having 10, 12, perhaps 16 people stay there, even though the inspector probably would never say that. So they couldn't be licensed. That would be my understanding anyway. And they openly say that they are in Austin, Texas, that you, in his quote is, you have the entire house to yourself. I think of that as like, it's like you can have as many people as you want. And right now it's winter, and the neighbors and all of us are, we're all cozied in, probably our curtains are closed, to try to stay warm. So it hasn't been something that you really notice, it's there. But anyway, so my question then is, what is in place to monitor and enforce non-compliant renters, the rentals, and the hosts? I mean, is there anything, in place? Do we have a simple, like, okay, this is what will happen? So anyway, that's a question I would ask all of you. Would 10, 12, 16 people in a 3-bedroom home violate a city's occupancy regulation? I mean, these are questions I'm asking of you because I don't know them. Is there a possibility that 10 or more people would host a loud party? What I would say quite easily, yes. I don't even know how they can stop at 10. I mean, other people who are friends of the people who are staying there supposedly could have friends that could come in. I mean, anyway, the numbers could be whatever they are. I think I've been told the answer now. I wanted to know if the owners could be required to close down their illegal rental. And I guess the answer is no. At this time, what authority does the city have to shut down illegal rooming houses? Is there actually an authority that can, do that? I would ask that be included in, whatever you might do about these TRHs. It's like, do we have anything? Is it there? And I would like to say, though, that the tourist rooming house page on the city website is very clear and very easy to understand. I mean, even I got it. There should be no question. I mean, and even when you are signing up for Airbnb, it says on the Airbnb website that people need to check with their cities and be in compliance with their cities. So that says to me, this guy didn't even do that. You know, he did, and it's so easy. Even if you type in short-term rental, it comes back to TRH on the city website. So even if you didn't have the word right, you would still get the information about what it is. Now, it's spelled out in detail. Sadly, to me, I didn't see any penalties listed. And that's where I think it should be, because that might help tell the people that are thinking about doing this, well, okay, if you don't do this, this is what's going to happen. So that's what I was looking at when I saw when I looked through the website. The homeowner on Ridge Road has shown that city ordinances are of little concern. And I take that very seriously where I live. I mean, you know, putting garbage carts away on the day of pickup. I mean, this past summer, there was an unusable, unsightly, dead, whatever you want to call it, hot tub in their driveway for months. It took 2 complaints. I didn't do that. But anyway, it took 2 complaints before these people got rid of it finally. And I think of this as a picture of who they are. It was the first, one neighbor filed a complaint on September 23rd, followed by a second complaint from a different neighbor several weeks later. November 4th is the date for the letter that the owner got. So anyway, it's kind of that picture, I guess, that I'm saying we need to look at, not just the instance, not just one thing, but let's look, is there a picture developing here? And in my opinion, there isn't any license for this residence. I mean, well, I know there isn't. They don't, you know, they haven't done it, even though they have applied to be compliant. And here are the reasons why I believe that, you know, it's like, as of February 2nd, there was no current licensed lodging by the city of Stevens Point for this address. The only ones listed as licensed are the Dalzell House on Main Street, the Claflin on Main, the Succulent Home on Prentice Street, and Susan's B&B on Church Street, which is a conditional non-owner occupied, and then Ruby's Coffee on 3rd Street. So, I mean, so they're not licensed, so we know that. That leaves Ridge House unlicensed, unregulated, and at least 4 others in the city. In a March 2019 memo to the city plan department, it stated there were 2 legal and around 20 illegal. I mean, but that's, you know, that's a year ago. So, in 9 months, only 1 came into compliance, as the other 2 are new, which would be Susan's on Church Street and then Ruby's. So, and secondly, and I've said this before, but no reasonable inspector would grant a residential home of 3 bedrooms for 10 people. And well, almost any number of children. I mean, the under 2 they're not counted, they're free. And so, anyway, and I guess in closing here, most homeowners don't spend all that money to buy a house. In a neighborhood we have a rather country environment. It's like you're living in the country, but we're in the city. Our lots are much larger, and but only to have ordinances that can't be enforced, or that allows a homeowner to set up a tourist rooming house that changes the neighborhood makeup and allows this business to operate without strict enforceable requirements to follow the law. And as I said, this is a generational neighborhood. And for somebody to come in for 2 years and then, have it all change has just been, it's just been difficult. And it's possibly my age thing too, I will admit that. But we, it's like I'm very passionate about my neighborhood. and I do all my own yard work, I do all my own everything. And so to see this other person just decide to do something without following any regulations is, anyway, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Comment to make. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry. Hi, I just wanted to state that I totally can relate to this because any part of the city that you live in, hopefully you're living in your area because you love your neighborhood and you have a home that you've invested in your own whatever amount of time or what you're doing with it. And I think that's why we were looking at this chapter 21 is so important for us to really take time and decide what things are really important and that they are upheld when we make an ordinance. And I'm still not really happy that we ever did a permit for non-occupied at all for these tourist rooming houses. That came up later on, was added in, and I don't think it did us any good. We've had this problem through all of our years, in Stephen's point, of conditional uses or things that have been, they can't prove something, so no one's going to do it unless you have a complaint, and our city has really been neglected in that way for many, many years, and I would hope that we look into this one and that should be fined. That fine should come through, and I don't understand why. And that was why I asked the question about fines, because I didn't see anything that said what the fines were and if they would go up. They don't have an egress for the basement window, for the window in the basement, and they have a bedroom there. Isn't that against ordinance in general? So shouldn't we have some kind of inspection done on this, and they should be withheld from having that many people?
There will be inspection if they did get the conditional use.
Yeah, I believe in one, I haven't gone through the house, no one in the department's gone through the house at all. In some of the photos, you can tell that there may not be an egress window in the basement unit, that is a violation of Universal Dwelling Code, and so we would definitely, as part of the inspection, that's also, when the health department will go in, they'll also take a building inspector in to look at these things, and that's just part of getting the permit through. This discussion on levying fines and things of that nature, there's some discretion that you have to leave up to your staff to enforce the zoning code. And we're kind of to the point with this specific item that the property owner is trying to come into compliance. They, again, have had no police reports. There's been no fire EMS calls. Staff, using our discretion, feel very comfortable in continuing to allow them until the conditional use permit goes through the process. And maybe they say no, and then at that point, we would simply say this is a violation of the use. Your conditional use permit was denied. Someone has to be living at the house in order to be permitted to use it as a tourist rooming house. That's just the discretion of staff. We again, because there haven't been these violations in the past, we haven't, violations wherein police were called, fire was called, EMS was called, and that there, prior to the end of January, no complaints against the property. We didn't feel as though it was, again, this zoning emergency where we needed to start issuing fines and things of that nature. Again, I've said it several times tonight, we try to work towards compliance before we start levying fines against property owners for use violations. I stand by my department's decision to do this. I have no objection to how we're doing it.
Could we add that there is a fine into our website now, so that does state it in there?
Yeah.
So that is something a little bit more. And also, the second thing would be, there were 2 complaints already, and so does it have to meet that it's a huge safety issue? If someone's doing this, they're non-compliant, but they've had 2 complaints about leaving for a couple months a hot tub in a driveway that's not usable. I mean, to me, that's very telling right there that it shouldn't have to be just that it's the police are called out there or that.
Sure. I mean, if there were, the hot tub situation, they had an inoperable hot tub up against the garage. Staff did go out. We sent a notice of violation. They ended up correcting the violation. If this was a perpetual thing wherein there are cars parked illegally all over the place, that there's dumpsters full of trash, then that could be something that we could leverage to say, hey, you're in violation, you need to stop being in violation until you get the proper permits. Again, one instance of a hot tub or some type of public nuisance isn't going to cause my department to issue red flags and be concerned about the current use of the property. Again, if there were multiple issues or multiple police, fire, EMS calls, then yes, we would probably send a notice that they need to cease operations immediately. We try to work towards compliance and, you know, leaving some discretion up to staff on how we go about enforcing zoning violations. I will add real quick that up until the complaint came in, because staff wasn't aware of it, if you went on our website and typed in short-term rental, Airbnb, VRBO, you wouldn't find anything. The search function on the city's website is not necessarily the greatest thing in the world. We had our website manager update it so that if you typed in Airbnb, short-term rental, tourist rooming house, that it would take you to that specific web page. So we are working towards addressing some of the concerns. And this is just part of the process as we go through the amend zoning code and ensuring that enforcement and that folks are aware of what they need to do in order to get these types of uses permitted or through the conditional use process itself.
Thank you. Anyone else? Anyone else out there who'd like to speak? Okay, well, this was a discussion-only item, so we don't need to take any action. And it is the last agenda item. So, we are adjourned. Number 5 is adjournment. We're adjourned at approximately 7:46.
Videos of these meetings are available for viewing on the city's website, stevenspoint.com/videos.